A Dangerous Game, Part 2. The revelation of the pregnancies rocked the small school community at Sunrise Secondary School. The quiet whispers in the hallways had turned into a loud buzz, and soon the entire school was talking about it. Amora, Nkem, and Uju had tried to keep it a secret, but rumors have a way of spreading faster than the truth. The girls barely spoke to each other, each wrapped in her own confusion and fear. In the midst of all this, Noso carried on as if nothing had happened. His charming smile and carefree attitude were still in place, though he could sense the shift in the way some teachers and students looked at him. But as always, Noso believed he could handle it. After all, his mother had always made his problem disappear, and he had no doubt that she would do the same this time. One afternoon, as Noso walked across the school grounds, Mr. Chokudi, the principal, approached him with a grave expression. "Noso, I need to have a word with you in my office," Mr. Chokudi said. His tone was heavy with the weight of the situation. Noso followed him, keeping his expression neutral, though inside he was calculating his next move. As they entered the office, Noso saw that Nurse Margaret was already seated, her face unreadable but serious. "Sit down, Noso," Mr. Chokudi instructed. The principal leaned forward on his desk, folding his hands. "We've come to learn about some troubling news," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing. "3 of our students are pregnant, and it seems there are rumors about your involvement." Noso remained calm. He had learned from his mother how to keep his emotions under control. "Sir, I don't know what you've heard, but I assure you, those are just rumors," he said smoothly. Mr. Chokudi glanced at Nurse Margaret, who nodded and spoke up. "Noso, the girls, Amora, Nkem, and Uju, they all came to me for medical help. I have confirmed their pregnancies. Each of them mentioned your name." For the first time, Noso felt a flicker of unease. He had thought the girls would stay silent. He hadn't anticipated that they would talk to the nurse. But he quickly regained his composure. "They're lying," Noso said, keeping his voice steady. "Maybe they've made up this story because they're scared, or maybe they don't want to face their own mistakes. But I had nothing to do with it." Nurse Margaret looked at him sharply. "You're saying all 3 of them are lying?" Noso's eyes darted to the floor for a moment, then he nodded. "Yes." Mr. Chokudi sighed heavily. "Noso, I've seen this before. It's not easy to deal with a situation like this, but you can't lie your way out of it. I'm going to have to escalate this to the school board, and the girls' families will be involved." The news spread quickly, and soon the parents of Amara, Nkem, and Uju were called in for a meeting. The school community, once tight-knit and focused on academic success, was now divided by whispers, anger, and confusion. The girls had each been sent home, their parents furious and embarrassed. They had all expected their daughters to excel academically, not end up pregnant. For the girls, the situation was a nightmare. Amora, who had always been the most confident and outspoken, now barely spoke. Nkem, quiet and shy, withdrew into herself, avoiding even her closest friends. Uju, always the mediator between her 2 friends, found herself isolated, her usual cheerful smile gone. Their parents were livid, and soon accusations flew in all directions. Some blamed the school for not having stricter rules, others whispered that Noso had used his charm to manipulate the girls. But deep down, everyone knew that there was more to the story than anyone wanted to admit. Meanwhile, in her luxurious home, Amoka Nook received a call from the school principal, explaining the gravity of the situation. At first, she refused to believe it. Her son, Noso, would never involve himself in such a scandal, she thought. But as the details of the pregnancies and the rumors of her son's involvement became clearer, Amoka realized that this was something even she might not be able to fix. The next morning, she arrived at the school in her chauffeur-driven car, stepping out with an air of authority. She was determined to protect her son, no matter what. As she walked into the principal's office, her face was a mask of determination. "Noso is innocent," she declared before anyone could speak. "I know my son, and he would never do something like this." But as the conversation went on, and the evidence began to pile up, Amoka's confidence started to crack. She listened as the principal laid out the details, the girls' testimonies, the timing of the pregnancies, and the fact that all three of them had pointed to Noso. For the first time in her life, Amoka was unsure. She had always believed her son could do no wrong, but now, faced with overwhelming evidence, doubt began to creep in. As the school board investigated the matter, Noso continued to live in denial. He refused to take responsibility for his actions, convinced that his mother would, as always, fix things for him. But the situation had spiraled out of control, and even Amoka was starting to realize that there were some things she couldn't fix with money or influence. The pressure mounted. Amora, Nkem, and Uju's families demanded answers and justice, and the school board was forced to take action. Noso's carefree life was crumbling around him, and he could no longer ignore the consequences of his actions. One evening, as he sat in his room, surrounded by the luxury he had always taken for granted, Noso began to feel the weight of his choices. The admiration from the PGs had been thrilling at first, but now it had turned into something darker, something that could destroy his future. In a final meeting with the school board, Noso was asked to come clean. The atmosphere was tense, and Amoka sat by her son's side, her once confident demeanor now replaced with quiet fear. Mr. Chokudi, Nurse Margaret, and the parents of the girls were present, waiting for the truth. Noso looked around the room, his eyes landing on each of the girls, who sat with their parents, looking scared and ashamed. For the first time, he felt a pang of guilt. This wasn't just a game anymore, people's lives were being affected. Amoka reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Tell them, Noso. Tell them it's all a misunderstanding. But Noso knew it wasn't. He could no longer deny what had happened, no matter how much he wanted to. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and faced the room. I did it, he said quietly. I'm responsible. Noso's confession hung in the air like a heavy weight. The room fell silent, everyone processing his admission. Amora's mother gasped audibly, while Nkem's father clenched his fist in quiet anger. Uju's parents exchanged a grim look, their earlier suspicions now confirmed. Amoka, still gripping her son's hand, felt the shock ripple through her. She had never imagined that her perfect son could actually be guilty of what she had so vehemently denied. Her whole world had revolved around making sure Noso had everything he needed, and now it was unraveling in front of her. How could you, she whispered, barely audible, her voice trembling with disbelief. Noso, after everything I've done for you. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Noso glanced at his mother, his once confident demeanor fading, replaced by a quiet realization that his actions had not only harmed the girls but shattered the illusion of invincibility he'd always believed in. Outside the school boardroom, Amora, Nkem, and Uju gathered with their families. Amora's mother had tears in her eyes, and her father stood silently, his face a mask of controlled rage. Amora, who had always been outspoken, now felt a mix of anger and sadness, her emotions swelling uncontrollably. As Noso and Amoka exited the boardroom, Amora broke away from her parents and marched toward him, her hands trembling. Noso, she called out, her voice shaking. Why? Why did you do this to us? Noso turned to face her, and for the first time, he couldn't meet her gaze. He had always been able to charm his way out of any situation, but now there was nothing he could say. Amora stepped closer, tears welling up in her eyes. You treated us like we were nothing, she continued. Like we didn't matter, like we were just part of your game. Nkem and Uju stood nearby, listening, their expressions mirroring the hurt in Amora's words. Nkem whispered, we trusted you. Noso opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The reality of the situation, the irreversible damage he had caused, finally hit him. He had been selfish, thinking only of himself and never considering the impact his actions would have on the girls' lives. I'm sorry, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. But Amora shook her head. Sorry isn't enough, Noso. Back at home, Amoka sat in her living room, staring blankly at the luxurious surroundings that had once brought her so much pride. For years, she had protected Noso, covering up his mistakes and ensuring he never faced any consequences. But now she realized that her unconditional indulgence had contributed to his downfall. She thought of all the warnings her friends had given her, especially Ngozi, who had cautioned her that raising a child without teaching them accountability would only end in disaster. Amoka had refused to listen. She had believed that her wealth and influence could shield her son from the realities of the world. But now she saw the bitter truth. Noso was unprepared for life's challenges because she had never allowed him to face them. The door creaked open, and Noso walked in, his shoulders slumped. He had been suspended from his teaching duties at the school, pending further investigation. The NYSC officials were involved now, and there was talk of legal action from the families of the girls. "Mom," Noso said quietly, standing in the doorway. Amoka turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and disappointment. "Noso, I wanted to give you the best of everything," she whispered. "But I realize now that I failed you. I never taught you how to take responsibility for your actions. And now, this." Noso sat down across from her, his face pale. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't think." "That's the problem, Noso," Amoka interrupted. "You didn't think. You never had to. I always fixed everything for you, and now I can't fix this." For the first time in his life, Noso felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. His mother, the one person who had always been his protector, was now facing the consequences of her own choices too. Amoka sat alone later that night, her thoughts racing. She knew that she could use her influence to get Noso out of this mess, at least legally. But a part of her wondered if doing so would only make things worse. If she saved him again, would he ever learn? Would he ever truly understand the gravity of what he had done? Her heart ached for him, but it also ached for the girls. Amora, Nkem, and Uju, they were young, with their whole lives ahead of them, and now everything had changed. They would carry this burden forever. What kind of future could they have? Amoka knew she had a choice to make. She could either continue shielding Noso, as she always had, or she could let him face the consequences of his actions, hoping that it would finally teach him the lesson he so desperately needed to learn. The next morning, Noso sat in his room, staring at the ceiling. The past few days had been a blur of emotions, accusations, and confrontations. He had always believed that life would be easy for him, that his charm and his mother's wealth would protect him from anything. But now he realized that no amount of money or influence could undo what he had done. A knock on his door brought him out of his thoughts. It was his mother. "Noso," she said, stepping inside. "We need to talk." He sat up, bracing himself for another lecture or another attempt to fix things. But what she said next surprised him. "I've decided I'm not going to use my connections to make this go away," Amoka said quietly. "You need to face this. You need to take responsibility for what you've done." Noso blinked, not sure he had heard her right. "What?" "But, Mom, you've always helped me. I've always protected you, and that's part of the problem," she replied. "This time, you need to learn that actions have consequences." Noso felt a wave of panic. He had never been in a situation like this before, one where there was no easy way out. But deep down, he knew his mother was right. "I face it," he said, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. Meanwhile, the parents of Amara, Nkem, and Uju gathered at the school for a final meeting with the school board. There had been discussions about what would happen next, whether Noso would face legal consequences, whether the girls would return to school, and what measures would be taken to prevent such incidents from happening in the future. Mr. Chokudi sat at the head of the table, his face solemn. "We've spoken to the families involved, and it's clear that this situation has affected everyone deeply," he began. "We will be taking steps to address the concerns raised, and Noso's suspension will continue while we investigate further." The parents were tense, but there was a shared understanding that they all wanted what was best for their daughters. Despite the pain and anger, they knew that healing would take time and justice, in some form, would have to be served. A few weeks passed, and the situation slowly began to settle. The families of the girls sought legal counsel, but they also focused on supporting their daughters through the difficult times ahead. Amora, Nkem, and Uju returned to school, though their lives were forever changed. The weight of what had happened hung over them, but they were determined to move forward. For Noso, life was no longer as carefree as it had once been. He had been removed from his NYSC duties and was facing potential legal repercussions. His relationship with his mother had shifted. She still loved him, but now there was an unspoken distance between them. He knew he had to earn back her trust, but more importantly, he had to rebuild himself. Months later, Noso stood outside the school gate, watching the students as they walked by, laughing and chatting as if nothing had ever changed. But for him, everything had changed. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first arrived at Sunrise Secondary School, full of arrogance and entitlement. He had learned the hard way that life wasn't just about charm and privilege. Actions had consequences, and those consequences affected more than just himself. As he stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it. As the sun set over the city of Enugu, Noso walked away from the school, the weight of his past mistakes still heavy on his shoulders. But there was something else now, something new. A sense of responsibility. A desire to make things right, not just for himself but for the people he had hurt. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was no longer the carefree boy who had arrived at Sunrise Secondary School. He was someone different now. Someone who had learned, finally, that the choices we make define who we are. And with that, Noso began his new chapter, ready to face whatever came next.
I hope you enjoyed the tale. If so, please like the video, comment, share it with your family and friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for more enchanting tales like this one. Goodbye.